we're gonna head into the last panel, where we're gonna focus on directors and choreographers with two lovely people. So first, we have Laura MacDonald. Laura MacDonald is assistant professor in the residential college in the Arts and Humanities at Michigan State University, where she teaches theater history, dramaturgy, and American studies. She researches the longevity of musicals, the transnational circulation of musical theater in Europe and East Asia, and the work of director Diane Paulus. Paulus? Did I say that wrong? Okay, there we go. So, take it away.
Thank you. Before I begin, I will mention that this will be an interactive presentation since it's the end of the day on Friday. Later in the PowerPoint, you're going to see a QR code to scan to access certain photos that I can't put on the screen. So please share your screen with your neighbors if they're struggling. And all the photos in the presentation without a caption are photos that I have taken. So it's a pleasure to be at this event, but in particular to be on a panel with Mary Jo Lodge, who was the first scholar I ever met 20 years ago to commit to studying women musical theater directors. Her efforts to document their practice gave me a precedent to point to and a model of how to do the work. I'm grateful for our years of dialogue and her support as I embarked on researching Diane Paulus. Thank you, Mary Jo. Last spring, I observed rehearsals for a new production of Georges Bizet's 1875 opera Carmen at Glyndebourne, which is the building on the left. It's a private opera company in the English countryside. One of the first things I heard upon entering the studio was Glyndebourne's music director and Carmen conductor, Robin Ticciati, flagging something that would need Diane magic. Others in the room were catching up on another Carmen that had just opened in London. It was a week into the rehearsal period, and Tunisian-Canadian mezzo-soprano Rehab Shayeb was soon singing Habanera, Carmen's entrance aria. She exited the cigarette factory through a caged enclosure, then climbed onto a pickup truck where she concluded the number. Diane Paulus, the production's director, wanted a physical gesture to accompany Carmen's final warning to the men, "Prends garde à toi." And Shayeb tried different arm movements before reminding everyone, "I learned how to sing, not how to dance." Opera singers are not triple threat performers, and Shayeb's concern helps to illustrate the differences between opera and Broadway musicals, though we might consider both musical theater. Diane magic and Paulus's collaborative approach would ensure Shayeb was confident and powerful above the men she was warning. A year earlier, at a design presentation with her collaborator, Ricardo Hernandez, Paulus explained to Glyndebourne staff that the truck would be the guardhouse in Carmen. Quote, "She'll be on top of that car for the habanera. We've talked a lot about her body on that car." Women exercising power, like Carmen scaling a guardhouse, unite the musicals that Paulus has directed, from Sheila protesting in Hair to the leading player Bertha, Fastrada, and Catherine in Pippin, and Jenna, Becky, and Dawn in Waitress, to mention only 3 productions. They haunt Carmen, and their influence begins to illustrate how musical theater craft might visit an opera production. Winning the Tony Award for Best Director of a Musical in 2013 for her revival of Pippin, Paulus became the 3rd woman to win the award, after Julie Taymor in 1998 and Susan Stroman in 2001. Other measures are also significant. 3 of Paulus's Broadway productions recouped their investments, but she says, quote, "There has been a sense that a woman can't lead a Broadway show because of the financial risk. There's this perception that the financial pressures of Broadway can't rest on a woman's shoulders," end quote. Here I'm building on Lodge, who also considers Tony Awards and commercial success as evidence of women directors breaking through on Broadway. Paulus's productions have also toured and circulated nationally and internationally, another measure of success. I'm interested in such circulation, but more so than individual musicals, today I want to explore the circulation of musical theater craft, from an American regional theater and Broadway stages to a British opera house. Though she is a veteran director of operas, I contend that the magic Paulus brought to Glyndebourne and Carmen was musical theater magic, her craft honed over years of helming musical theater productions. Here. She gravitates towards musicals that will inspire and educate audiences, she explains, quote, because I know the profound impact a musical can have. Waitress is a deeply human story that deals with a massively prevalent issue in our society, domestic violence, and it does so with songs and humor, which can be an important way in for many people, end quote. Paulus's Carmen was similarly impactful in making audiences think about violence against women and feel their experience of pursuing freedom. By focusing on this production today, my aim is to articulate how a director's musical theater craft can have value and make an impact. As Lodge and Anne Healy observe, quote, somehow the person who has the responsibility of shaping the production audiences see, from the design to the concept to the execution, manages to be an enigma to all those not deeply immersed in theater, end quote. But inscribing this shaping of a production and oversight of its design and concept, Lodge and Healy provide us with a starting point for trying to identify a director's craft. Elsewhere, Lodge advocates for, quote, an exploration of the lives, thoughts, experiences, and perspectives, end quote, of women director choreographers, and I employ a similar method here. So to begin, I'll offer a brief overview of milestones in Paulus's life and career. I'll also introduce Glyndebourne as an opera company before sharing rehearsal observations and my conclusions on how Paulus's musical theater craft manifested in Carmen at Glyndebourne. Paulus's parents, Lawrence Paulus and Teruko Uchida, met and fell in love in post-World War II occupied Japan, where Paulus was serving with a U.S. Army entertainment unit. They married and raised 3 children on New York City's Upper West Side. Uchida considered opera the greatest art form. Sometime in 1974-1975, she took her youngest daughter, 8-year-old Diane, to see her first opera, Carmen at the Met, because the opera had children in it. This image is important, I think, because beyond a parent-child relationship, we see a girl and a woman in a viewing relationship. These kinds of relationships reoccur through Paulus's productions. This is where the interaction happens. Now conjure the images in your mind of any Diane Paulus production you have seen and think about those viewing relationships between the female characters. We see this especially in the friendships in Waitress and the range of women's relationships seen in Jagged Little Pill. There is support, judgment, mutual influence, and many other complexities in women's relationships that we don't see enough of in musicals, so I'll return to this idea with the women in Carmen. Intentionally blank slide. Paulus grew up studying ballet and piano, attended an all-girls school, and continued engaging with Carmen, including seeing the 1983 Peter Brook adaptation at Lincoln Center's Vivian Beaumont Theater. She participated in student theater while attending Harvard, then studied acting and performed with her own theater company before committing to directing and studying with André Serban and Anne Bogart at Columbia University. Fueled by a desire to create visceral performance events using popular culture to connect with audiences, she made her way to Broadway via The Donkey Show, a long-running disco-infused immersive adaptation of Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream that ran off-Broadway but garnered major attention. And a decade later, she arrived on Broadway with a revival of the musical Hair. As she prepared for Hair in 2008, she was announced as the new artistic director of the American Repertory Theater at Harvard, which she continues to lead. Over her tenure at ART, Paulus recruited a wide range of leading artists in and outside of the theater to collaborate with her on new musicals and revivals, yielding all of her Broadway productions since Hair. But directing an opera at Glyndebourne was on her bucket list. The Country House in Sussex, 2 hours south of London, has hosted an opera festival since 1934. John Christie resolved to establish a summer opera festival at his house in England after attending the Salzburg and Bayreuth opera festivals on his honeymoon. And that is the house. But we're gonna go to the auditorium. A 300-seat auditorium was built for that first season in 1934 and was enlarged over the years to increase seating capacity and rehearsal space. John's son, George Christie, took over the festival in 1962, eventually deciding that a new theater needed to be built. It opened in 1994, which is the auditorium you see here. And just for some context, here are the capacities of other houses where we might see operas or musicals. So Glyndebourne, sitting at 1,200 seats, is a very intimate opera house. Not far off, though, the Lena Horne Theater, where Waitress ran on Broadway. So a kind of scale of auditorium that Paulus is often working in, and twice the size of the Loeb Drama Center at the ART, where she regularly directs. Okay, slide. We'll stay here. Directing Monteverdi's Orfeo for Chicago Opera Theater early in her career, Paulus was mentored by the company's general director, Brian Dickey, who had spent 27 years working at Glyndebourne. He told Paulus about the unique opera company. Quote, "I'm so interested in theater as ritual and theater going as ritual," Paulus says, but having staged Romeo and Juliet within months of Carmen, she explains that she's interested in so much more than 2 hours traffic of our stage, as mentioned in the prologue. Quote, "What happens before? What happens after? Glyndebourne is the epitome of opera as experience, albeit a very particular tradition associated with a certain class and a history of black tie, English countryside kind of refinery," end quote. Paulus was fascinated by the idea of opera goers taking a whole day out of their lives to travel, make a picnic, and see an opera at 4 in the afternoon. So you can see people strolling here. There's a gentleman at a picnic table over there and another gentleman over there. And then we have some more picnickers here. Some people are on the ground, some people are on their tables. The festival operates without a subsidy, so tickets are not inexpensive, and this summer they range from $110 to £295 or $150 to $400 a ticket. Such ticket prices afford audiences access to the festival's regular orchestras, the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment and the London Philharmonic, along with the world's leading singers, directors, and designers. Stephen Langridge had long been aware of Paulus's work when he was appointed artistic director of Glyndebourne in 2018 and recruited her to direct. He thought she might bring a good mix of skills and be able to, quote, "do what a particular piece and a particular place needs at a particular time. Not all directors, especially not all directors in opera, do that," end quote. Beyond Paulus's childhood experience of Carmen, given her track record in working with Shakespeare, popular music, films, writers from all kinds of writing, and composers of all kinds, it makes sense for her to stage one of the world's most popular operas. Quote, "The music of Carmen is full of the greatest hits of popular culture," she says, "film scores, you name it. I'm always interested in any work of art that has resonance outside its artistic purview into culture at large," end quote. So she wondered, what does it mean to do this opera now as a woman? Following the cigarette factory worker Carmen's romance with the soldier Don José's and their involvement with smugglers, Carmen pursues a relationship with the bullfighter Escamillo. This enrages Don José, who reacts to the rejection by killing her. This femicide led Paulus to explore ongoing violence against women and to connect Carmen to the courage of Iranian women active in the woman life freedom protest movement. If Carmen can't survive, Paulus says, quote, "that's the world we're in and there's nothing to shy away from," end quote. Paulus framed the opera's bohemians as contemporary unrecognized populations without rights, gathered at borders or in detention facilities. She imagined these communities as forced laborers in an unspecified but recognizable location with a masculine military presence. The smugglers were thus not smuggling contraband goods, but rather refugees, and Michaela became an aid worker. Paulus recruited her frequent collaborator, the scenic designer Hernandez, who was simultaneously designing the feminist musicals Suffs and Lempicka on Broadway, so he was actually absent when I visited, as well as choreographer Yasmin Vardaman, ensuring that dance would be as important a world-building tool for Carmen as it has been in Paulus's Broadway musicals. Paulus's choice to set Carmen in the present and to engage with ongoing global issues, including the refugee crisis and femicide, ensured that the opera production continued her commitment to centering women's stories and engaging audiences with ongoing crises. So just a few contextual points. There are multiple Carmens in the world. One had recently opened in New York at the Met, directed by the British director Kerry Cracknell. I mentioned the London production that opened while Carmen was in rehearsal at Glyndebourne. Paulus had just co-directed Becoming a Man with P. Carl about his journey as a trans man, and then following Carmen, she returned to the US to direct N.A., the Nancy Pelosi, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez play off Broadway, and then followed that with Romeo and Juliet. So a bit of a busy year. And as I mentioned, Hernandez was working on Suffs and Lempicka. Early in any production, Paulus has every performer present a character exercise where they answer questions about their characters and respond to prompts. She explains, they have to say things like, my greatest fear is, my greatest strength is, I'm the one who, in 5 years, I will be. The actors have to present an object that reveals something about their character. They have to do a dance. They have to do an action that expresses emotion. This exercise establishes every performer's agency and creativity regardless of their role. Shayeb, who is playing Carmen, recalls her experience participating in the character exercise. Quote, I was terrified because I've realized I learned how to sing and not to speak. Even though I'm a great actress, I can hide behind singing, but when you're just acting with your own voice, it's like, oh shit, it's me. Shayeb's entrance for the character presentation became Carmen's entrance. In response to a prompt asking each performer to play music, she said, quote, I went in the truck and I blasted Freedom by George Michael. Nobody told me to not do that, and I did end up using the truck, but just in another way and talking about freedom in the habanera. And if you're ready to scan a QR code, we're looking for photo number 2, the second photo from the top of the photo gallery. Hands up when you see the photo. Hurrah, well done. So this is the moment where Shayeb is entering and repeating that work that she did in the exercise. So you can keep the gallery up on your phones, and we'll look at waitress photos. Leading Carmen, Paulus built on the achievements of 2 new musicals that she developed at the American Repertory Theater and opened on Broadway, Waitress in 2016 and Jagged Little Pill in 2019. Both musicals center multiple women in contemporary contexts and challenge their audiences to engage with pressing issues, including domestic violence, sexual assault, and drug addiction. Those characters, like Shayeb's Carmen, were also seeking freedom in their lives. Jenna, an unhappy waitress and pie baker who is unexpectedly pregnant, is supported and encouraged by her friends and coworkers, Dawn and Becky, as you see in these 2 photos. The women share their hopes and dreams, and we see them navigating relationships with the men in their lives, as well as pursuing sexual pleasure. They have much in common with Carmen, Mercedes, and Frasquita, and at times in rehearsals, performers seem to react to Paulus's efforts to tell these women's stories, rather than sticking with the romances and the male military figures. And you can see these women in Carmen in photo number 9. If you scroll, it should be 3 up from the bottom, and you'll see the women together, which I think it's pretty clear, the connections to the way we see the women in Waitress. In a rehearsal for Act 2, when the smugglers are recruiting the 3 women to help them, Elizabeth Boudreau, playing Frasquita and appearing at Glyndebourne for the first time, was uncertain of how to best keep an eye on the conductor while managing the quick singing and business with her scene partners and a map. Shayeb reassured her, saying, I'm here, I'm with you. In photo number 11, you can see Carmen and Mercedes seeing past the men to see each other. I only noticed this in the photo recently, and I think it's really striking. You can really see that connection between the 2 women. This production of Carmen opened with a young girl sneaking out from a gap in an upstage wall and walking downstage to peer at the caged enclosure where the factory workers would soon be on break. The girl is scared off by soldiers, but leaves a flower in the chain link fencing that later triggers Carmen's affair with Don Jose. And I have a note for photo number 8. I'm not sure exactly what we're seeing. I think that's one of the final scenes. I think it's at Carmen solo on stage. Paulus brought the same girl back in the opera's final scene. This is outside the bullfighting arena. And this young girl witnesses Carmen being strangled by Don Jose. And she's quickly joined by Mercedes and Frasquita, bearing further witness. Then one by one, all of the women who are spectators in the arena above Carmen's murder scene stand to join the witnessing. The volume of women's gazes holding Don Jose, but perhaps also the audience, accountable is a powerful image, and it's one I can't disconnect from Paulus's musical theater women on Broadway. An audience member posted on social media, quote, "This is my favorite production of Carmen ever. This was edgy, the sets amazing, and the drama tension of the storytelling showing the violence to women juxtaposed with the beautiful music and singing, truly amazing contemporary production." Language, the artistic director, considers it a success and an accessible opera production that you could take anyone to. And he points to the colorful and lively Act 4 opening as an example, and you can get a sense of this in photo number 6. Paulus, he says, understands audiences. Quote, "That musical theater background means you understand commercial theater as well, and you know that the art can also have the quality of entertainment about it, and I think that comes through," end quote. Opera Canada critic Hadani Ditmars called Shayeb's Carmen, quote, "both beguiling and belligerent, seductive and self-reliant, and her fate at the hands of her spurned lover, the result of her final act of empowered defiance," end quote. He observed a rodeo of sexualized parry and thrust, with Carmen remaining in full control even as they tried to subdue her. The singer and director's collaboration was a success, and Shayeb says, "It was quite magical with Diane. This is a Carmen that we created together with my instincts and her directions." Paulus's skill in developing and directing new American musicals has currency with this opera company seeking to maintain and expand its audience. Her experience in centering women's stories and engaging audiences with issues like sexual assault and domestic violence were an important foundation for this Carmen. Oh, we're jumping ahead. Okay, here we go, last slide. As I returned to Michigan after seeing Carmen at Glyndebourne, I watched Paulus's Waitress on the plane. The circulation of her storytelling continued. From Jenna to Carmen, women's complex experiences and pursuit of agency in their own lives make for compelling musicals and operas that sell tickets. You may already know what baking can do. I hope that today I've shed more light on what directing can do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The line that I keep going back to, which it may be just because I'm dim, but who was it that's toward the beginning you talked about? It was a quotation from someone about not being able to rely on a woman to carry.
That was Diane.
So
yeah. Her experience was there was not faith in women being able to lead a big budget commercial musical.
So it was just production. A general sense.
Just a general sense, and yet she's had 3 musicals on Broadway that have recouped.
Have there been any? Do you know the statistics behind like recoup flop if it were to be broken down by gender, or you're the one that's going to know that? So we'll know about that.
We'll hear a little bit.
Does anybody have any questions? Stacy.
Yes, I have 2 questions. Laura, I'm so excited that you're working on Paulus and working on this show. This is great and really important. I have 2 questions, and you can answer either or both.
Okay.
They're not related to one another. One is, just can you talk more about the importance of ART as a place that has launched so many successful Broadway musicals? I mean, the only other place I can think of that does that has been La Jolla, but kind of the importance of Paulus helming, a theater that is actually owned by a university that's currently struggling, and I don't know. I'm just curious about ART, and it's really important. And then my other question is, why were there so many Carmens in 2024?
Well, I think everyone in this room knows a theater company, a symphony orchestra, opera company that is struggling. So what do? You put on the surefire hits, and so Carmen is going to make money for everyone, pretty much. So, but it's also, I asked Stephen Langridge, the artistic director, about this, and he said it's just how it goes. Sometimes everybody's doing the same opera at once, and Carmen is just so popular, it's always going to come around. So no one seemed particularly phased. It just seemed business as usual. And I didn't mention, but Glyndebourne has a first cast and a second cast, and the Carmen in the second cast was the first Carmen in the Met Opera, Eigel with the long last name. Rehab Shayab has done many Carmens as well and was singing other Carmens last year and this year. So yeah, I think it's just the standard rep. Regarding the ART, there's lots to say. I don't know everything, but we know a lot of new musicals are developed out of town at regional theaters. I think Paulus and the ART have refined that in some unique ways. And so now, whether it's a musical Paulus is directing or another creative team is leading, they really know how to scale up a production. So for example, Natasha and Pierre spent time at the ART, and part of that time was kind of sharing the knowledge of this is what has to happen if you're going to take this to a Broadway house. And because Paulus has established relationships with the Weislers, with producers like Jeffrey Richards, I think she's able to connect them. So Real Women Have Curves is on Broadway now, and the Weislers are the lead producers, and the ART developed that show last year. So they receive a lot of proposals of musicals that want to be developed there, and I think it's because the audience is very loyal. There's a good musical theater audience there, and the theater itself, the infrastructure is there to do the things you need to do to test out, whether it's testing out a poster design or a social media strategy, not just the theater that's on the stage. In terms of Harvard, I'm not going to comment on that because it's honestly not something that we've talked about it's early days in this research, but yes, that does make it interesting as well that this is on the campus of a university, so stay tuned.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Laura, thank you so much for this work. I agree with Stacy. I think this is so important, and I've been so glad to sort of watch this journey along with you as you study Paulus. And I just have a question that hadn't occurred to me until I heard this work. And I feel like we had a conversation at one point. I'm curious about either Diane's thoughts or your observations as a scholar in terms of, I'm spending a lot of time looking at women trying to get into directing on Broadway. What has the reception been for women directors in opera company, or more specifically, Diane's experience?
So she started with operas in Chicago very early on and was collaborating with a woman conductor, and did multiple operas in Chicago, Magic Flute in Toronto at the Canadian Opera Company. Rehab Shayab was actually a young artist there and understudied a role, so had a little experience with Paulus there. So I asked Glyndebourne a little bit about this. Women have directed there before. Paulus might be the first American woman. Nobody could confirm that. American men have directed there, but Francesca Zambello has not directed there, so I haven't found other American women. The conductor for the second cast was a woman, so I think Glyndebourne is a company that is trying to hire women, but not expose someone who's not ready yet to take the lead. Regarding other companies, I'm not gonna. Yeah, I don't have a whole lot I can share yet on that. But it's a good comparison to try to make, because the public opera companies are subsidized, and so what impact does that have when it's a public subsidized house?
I think there was one more question.
Hi, I had a question about the Donkey Show and like kind of that influence on Diane Paulus's kind of like directing. I know you're focusing on the music, like main musical theater, but I did see the Donkey Show when it was at ART, or I experienced the Donkey Show when it was at ART, and it was just such a different thing that she was doing before she kind of like went into running ART and directing for Broadway, kind of like an early period. I'm wondering like if you see that influence carrying through.
Yeah, I think Diane would say it's not a different thing. It's all the same. It's all expanding the boundaries of theater and engaging the audience. But what I find exciting about the Donkey Show, Paulus's mother was a fan of the all-female Takarazuka review in Japan, and so Paulus saw them perform in New York and studied a documentary film, and so that was part of the inspiration of the Donkey Show, of what happens when you have an all-female or majority female cast. So that's one of the ways that I think about the Donkey Show, is that's kind of the first chapter in what happens when we have a majority of women's bodies on stage telling these stories. And again, conjure those images of productions you've seen that came later. And so I think that's how the Donkey Show connects to those. She hasn't stopped doing more immersive work. It's just not her full-time approach or the concept, but I think there have been projects at the ART that have, if not been immersive in the way we kind of think of the definition of immersive, then a lot of audience engagement. She established something called Act 2, where after the performance ends, there's additional programming. And some productions at the ART have had elements where the audience is invited onto the stage afterwards, like the back wall opens up and there's a garden and the audience is invited on. So it's not quite what we would consider conventional immersive theater, but it's the similar idea of building a world that includes the audience alongside with the world of the play. Does that make sense? Yeah. Thank you. Great question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Such a nice transition to Mary Jo. Mary Jo Lodge is a professor of theater at Lafayette College in Pennsylvania and is the head of the theater department. She is an active director choreographer and has published numerous articles and book chapters on the musical, as well as edited 2 scholarly collections, Dueling Grounds, Revolution and Revelation in Raw Musical Hamilton, with co-editor Paul Laird for Oxford University Press, and Milestones in Musical Theater for Routledge.
Thank you. Thank you all. So let's talk about women directors. And so I've titled this The Last 25 Years, Women Directors and Director Choreographers on Broadway. So over my desk in my office, I've hung 2 postcards from 2019 side by side in a single frame. Here it is. The first lists the names of all of the women who have won the Pulitzer Prize in Drama since its inception, which fits on a postcard because there are only 19 names. The second, in a larger font, lists the last names of the 10 women who have won the Tony Awards for direction of a play or musical on Broadway in the entire history of those awards. Of course, time has passed since these were issued in 2019, and 3 names have been added to the Pulitzer list: Katori Ha, Senes Tusi, and Ebony Booth. 2 female directors have joined the list of Tony-winning women. Marianne Elliott won for directing the revival of the musical Company in 2022, while Diane Paulus, as we heard about from Julie Taymor on Wednesday, won in 2024 for the musical The Outsiders. These lists, which now include 22 Pulitzer Prize winners and 12 Tony winners who are women, and the postcards they appear on, were sold in the online store of The Interval, a website started by journalist Victoria Myers in 2014, where Shoshana has worked too. That aimed to change, quote, the conversation surrounding women in theater. It shut down in June of 2019. While awards are certainly not the only measure of progress for a field, it is disheartening to see the postcard-sized list of names, especially for the female directors. Just 6 have won for Best Direction of a Play, and 6 for Best Direction of a Musical ever, when the names of the many men who have claimed those awards would require a poster or even a full wall. I've placed the frame postcards so I see them every time I sit down at my computer because representation matters. It matters to me as a female director to see that other women have successfully done that job at the highest level of professional theater in America. As a female director choreographer, it is important to me to know about the women who have worked on Broadway as director choreographers. I chose the subject as the focus of my dissertation research because I wanted to learn what I could from both their artistry and their journeys. Intentionally blank. In 2008, my chapter, The Rise of the Female Director Choreographer on Broadway, was published in the groundbreaking book, Women in American Musical Theater, which was edited by Bud Coleman and Judy Sebesta. The chapter grew out of that dissertation research, where I more specifically examined the unprecedented emergence of 6 female director choreographers on and off Broadway in the 1999-2000 season. This sudden explosion of women working as director choreographers, only 2 women had previously directed on and choreographed on Broadway in its entire history, or so I thought, which itself came just 1 year after the first Tony Awards for Best Direction of a Play and Best Direction of a Musical were won by women, Gary Hines and, of course, Julie Taymor. It seemed to herald the start of a new era of gender equity for women directors and director choreographers, particularly of musicals on Broadway. In this essay, I examine what has happened on Broadway for women directors and director choreographers in the 25 years since the 1999-2000 season, with a particular focus on the 2024-25 Broadway season. I can now say with certainty that the optimistic future I predict for gender equality for Broadway directors and choreographers of musicals I predicted in 2008 did not come to pass. This paper then offers a state of the profession today for women directors and director choreographers of musicals on Broadway, and is a rare opportunity for me to revisit and rethink my earlier examination on the same subject. I will begin at the end and then look back to see how Broadway got where it is today. The main resource I used for this paper is the Internet Broadway Database, which is run by the Broadway League in association with the Theater Development Fund and New York State. While the information in the database had been previously collected, it was not released to the public until 1996 and was not anywhere near the comprehensive resource it is today at the time I was doing my dissertation starting in 1998. I instead relied on Stanley Green's regularly updated book, Broadway Musicals Show by Show, which at the time I thought was more comprehensive than it actually was. Along with records and the directory from the Stage Directors and Choreographers Foundation, which enabled me to find all of the women I had wanted to contact for my dissertation. I researched female director choreographers Susan Stroman, Kathleen Marshall, Pat Birch, Graziella Danielle, Anne Reinking, and Lynn Taylor Corbett, and I interviewed all of them for my research. Of all of them, only Marshall, Stroman, and Danielle remain active in the field. I want to acknowledge and again thank Lynn Taylor Corbett, who passed away in January of this year, because she was the first one to respond to my interview request, and she helped me secure all of the other interviews by personally calling the subjects, her friends and mentors, and vouching for me to the artists I needed to speak with after she learned of the focus of my work. This research would not exist if not for her intervention. For this new work, however, I worked with my student research assistants, Sophia Gall and Elliot Park at Lafayette College, to use ibdb.com and take a more comprehensive look at both the 24-25 season and a broader look at the director-choreographer on Broadway since 1950. Using the handy season tool on IBDB, we were able to determine that there were 43 shows in the 24-25 season, which opened with Ben Platt's Live at the Palace on May 28th, 2024, and extended through the opening of Dead Outlaw on April 27th, 2025. Of those 43 shows, 22 were musicals, or 51%, 21 were plays, 49%. I was surprised that it was an almost even split. Of those 22 musicals, 3 had the same individual serve as both director choreography. And all of those were men, with 2 making their director-choreographer debut on the show. Boop the Musical is veteran Jerry Mitchell's 4th endeavor on Broadway as director-choreographer. 4 women served as director, but of 5 shows. Tina Landau directed 2 of the musicals in the 24-25 season, but they didn't choreograph those musicals on Broadway. Male directors helmed the remaining 14 musicals. Thus, men directed and choreographed 17 of the 22 musicals on Broadway this season, meaning men were in charge of 77% of this year's musicals. Women helmed just 5 shows, or 23%, and there were no female director choreographers on Broadway this season. Go. When I prepared my abstract for this conference months ago, I did not imagine that the landscape for women director choreographers on Broadway would be as bleak in 2025 as it turned out to be. I also did not know in 2008 how very wrong I would turn out to be about the progress of women in theater. So, how did this happen? My original plan was to explore possible reasons by placing the 2024-25 season in the context of the 25 years since the season I first wrote about in my dissertation, 1999-2000. As I combed through the data, however, my project expanded and indeed is likely to still expand more, as I found it difficult to talk about the director-choreographer now without talking about the director-choreographer in musical theater history. I first decided to go back 25 years before the 99-2000 season to mirror the original 25-year span I was studying, but that 25-year range put me right in the middle of the golden age of the director-choreographer in the 70s, so I backed up another 25 years to also examine the data from between 1950 to 1975 to explore the earlier days of the director-choreographer. I was then able to draw some comparisons about gender and the director-choreographer between 3 periods of study, 1950 to 75, 76 to 2000, 2001 to 2025. I did opt to eliminate shows from consideration for this study that ran for 7 performances or fewer, as those tended to account for concerts and reunion and did not fit the spirit of my investigation, which was finding out about women who successfully directed and choreographed on Broadway. For additional context, in my dissertation work, I spent a great deal of time on Agnes DeMille's direction and choreography of Rodgers and Hammerstein's ill-fated 1947 musical Allegro, which credits her as the first female director choreographer on Broadway, though that is a bit of a misnomer because she was replaced by Hammerstein during the process as director, though he was uncredited for that role. Thus, 3 years before the first period started here, Broadway got its first female director choreographer, at least in name, even if in practice it wasn't quite the case. Moving forward, from 1950 to 1975, director choreographers were just starting to move into prominence. 43 musicals in this period were helmed by a director choreographer, and perhaps unsurprisingly, 42 of them were men. Also notably in this period, no less than 20 different men served as director choreographers, with the most prolific being Michael Kidd, who helmed 7 shows, Bob Fosse, who did the same for 4 shows in this period. Gower Champion had 6 in this period, while Jerome Robbins helmed 4. Little has been written about director choreographer Jill Layton, who also helmed 4 shows as director choreographer in this era, including No Strings and George M., despite a career as a director and director choreographer that extended from 1962 to 1990. The lone woman who directed and choreographed a show in this period had not been covered in the sources I originally used for my dissertation. Danya Krupska directed and choreographed a 16-performance revival of The Most Happy Fella at New York City Center in 1959 after serving as just the choreographer of the original production 3 years earlier. Thus, this previously unknown to me production may actually make Krupska the first female director choreographer to work on Broadway. 1976 to 2000 represents a true golden age for the director choreographer. 80 productions total in this period were under the control of a director choreographer, nearly doubling the number of shows that used director choreographers in the previous 25 years. 66 shows, or 82%, were directed and choreographed by 39 different male director choreographers in that period. The most prolific male director choreographers of this era, I've listed them here. Tommy Tune includes names you would know, like Bob Fosse, Michael Bennett. There were also women who emerged as director choreographers in this period, and not just in that halcyon time between 1999 and 2000, when the women I profiled in my dissertation suddenly worked on Broadway en masse. In fact, so the women arrive. So there were 80 productions. 14 productions, or 18%, were staged by 9 different female director choreographers, with Graziella Daniele and Susan Stroman being the most prolific. In my dissertation, I said that Graziella Daniele's Once on This Island in 1990 marked the first successful production with a female director choreographer at the helm. However, the more comprehensive information available today reveals that there were other women working in this era that hadn't been covered. So we've heard first already about Runaways, Elizabeth Swatos from 1972. She is credited as director and choreographer, though the show did not function as a dance-driven musical in the traditional sense and used a cast of children. Also, legendary modern dance choreographer Twyla Tharp directed and choreographed an ahead of its time stage adaptation of the hit film musical Singin' in the Rain in 1984. Eleanor Risa directed and choreographed the 1991 review Those Were the Days, subtitled, quote, the new English-Yiddish musical review, which again was not a musical that fit the typical fare for the director-choreographer. I also did not include Arlene Phillips in my original study, though she directed and choreographed in Saturday Night Fever in 1999, right in the original period I researched, so I should have. She didn't appear in much of the press at that time, so she sort of flew under the radar a little bit. So in addition to those 4 women, the aforementioned Graziella Daniele was joined as director-choreographer by Susan Stroman, Pat Birch, Ann Ranking, and Lynn Taylor Corbett. I just want to note that I included Kathleen Marshall in my dissertation research, who had not yet at that time directed and choreographed on Broadway, but she was in that same season helming Saturday Night off Broadway. Okay, so that brings us to the most recent 25-year period, and this again is the window between my dissertation season and today. So between 2001 and 2025, 63 musicals were produced that were helmed by director choreographers. Of those, 45% or 71% were directed and choreographed by men. Notably, of those 45 shows, 33 of them were directed and choreographed by the same 10 men, while in total, 22 men directed and choreographed in this period. This is a big reduction, 43% fewer, in fact, from the 39 men who directed and choreographed during the golden age of 1975 to 2000. The most prolific director-choreographer of this most recent period was Casey Nicholaw, who has helmed 9 shows and 2 additional ones as just director, making him the second most prolific director-choreographer of all time, just behind Susan Stroman, who helmed just slightly fewer than Nicholaw in this period, but started as a director-choreographer on Broadway sooner than he did, with 3 shows in the last era as well. So as you can see up there, Nicholaw was followed in productivity by Warren Carlyle, Jerry Mitchell, and Jeff Calhoun. So while overall, in this period, women collectively directed and choreographed more shows than they had done previously, 18 to the 14 in the last era. Only 5 different women total staged all of those musicals. Stroman helmed 7 shows, and Kathleen Marshall was just behind her with 6, while Twyla Tharp staged 3, and Graziella Daniele and Marcia Milgram Dodge staged 1 each. Milgram Dodge, who was already an active director-choreographer, got her Broadway break on the Broadway revival of Ragtime in 2009, but hasn't directed on Broadway again since. Perhaps the most shocking statistic
is that since Marsha Milgram Dodge's 2009 debut, no other woman who had not previously directed and choreographed on Broadway has served as a director-choreographer. It has been 16 years since a woman made her Broadway director-choreographer debut. As of the time of this presentation, it has been not quite 3 weeks since a male director-choreographer made his, Sergio Trillo on Real Women Have Curves. So, in the entirety of its history, just 12 women have served as director-choreographers for Broadway musicals. Almost twice as many men have served as director-choreographers in just the last 25 years. The real question, and the focus of my continued research on this subject, is why? Generally speaking, more women are directing musicals than ever before on Broadway. In the 24-25 season, 4 women directed 5 shows, and since 2001, 34 women have directed musicals on Broadway. But the numbers for female director-choreographers are starker. Susan Stroman, again, is currently the most prolific director-choreographer in history, male or female. But women without proven Broadway track records, and even ones with them, are not, for the most part, being entrusted with directing and choreographing, with the notable exceptions of Stroman and Marshall, who between them staged 13 shows as director-choreographer since 2001 of the 63 musicals helmed by director-choreographers, or a whopping 20% of them, just those 2 women. When I wrote my dissertation all those years ago, I based my title, Dancing Up the Broken Ladder, on a quote by Julianne Boyd in reference to a study she conducted in 1983 for the League of Professional Theater Women with Kay Carney, which said, quote, "We found that in general, women could get just so far as directors. Then they'd run up against what we called the broken ladder syndrome. Women can direct in regional theaters off-Broadway or off-Broadway, but when it comes to large commercial Broadway productions, producers are not willing to put their millions of dollars as well as their faith and belief in a woman director." This is so echoed by Paulus years later. Perhaps the broken ladder is simply still there, though it may have been disguised by a period of progress for female director-choreographers, particularly from 1999 to 2009. Which I previously speculated may have emerged because of the outsized toll the AIDS epidemic took on the Broadway community. Specifically, because Broadway has, and had, a large community of gay men in the ranks of its creators, and because of the untimely deaths of so many gay men from AIDS in the 1980s and 90s, who were performers and may have been the next Broadway director-choreographers, there were more openings for director-choreographers which women stepped in to fill. In 1997, the number of deaths from AIDS-related illnesses decreased for the first time, just before women emerged on Broadway as director-choreographers in record numbers. Over the last 25 years, of the 22 different men who have served as Broadway director-choreographers, 77% identify as gay. 2 identify as straight, and information was not available for the remaining 3, perhaps indicating the resurgence of the gay male director-choreographer on Broadway once AIDS was no longer a death sentence. I will continue to investigate the gender disparity in Broadway directors and choreographers on Broadway and its causes as I continue to develop this project. I wish, in the meantime, the interval was still around to produce one more postcard with the names of the only 12 women to have ever directed and choreographed musicals on Broadway. That, for me, is more work worth framing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary Jo. I saw you, I think, present on your dissertation version
Way back.
a million years ago, and this was really interesting. I wonder if I guess my question is, have you spoken to any either choreographers or directors about the challenge of, or ways in which they've been pushed out and haven't been hired to do both? Do you have?
I have not interviewed more of the few current women that have broken through since. Interestingly, I did do a survey connected with my dissertation, I never expected to be able to interview all 6 of those women, and I would not have had Lynn Taylor Corbett not have intervened. So I had this secondary plan of doing a survey of regional women director choreographers, and one of the few women that responded to that request was Marsha Milgram Dodge, who, as it turns out, is the only other new person to have directed since then. So I found when I was doing my dissertation research, and I think so much of this is a product of the time, none of the women I spoke with were eager to characterize themselves as like their strength being they're a woman director. It was like, well, I don't see gender. I don't see myself as any different. I see myself as just one of the other directors. It was very difficult to get sort of to pin them down to talk about that thing. I think because it was kind of a hazard toward their career advancement to talk about it at the time. I would like, I think as this project develops, to revisit some of those interviews, but there really isn't also a comprehensive look at the director choreographer over time, which is not what I was originally planning to do, but it's where this is sort of seems to be going, and I think might be a useful conversation. And I think it would also be interesting to get some of the men's perspectives. But the numbers are insane. I couldn't believe that no women had directed and choreographed on Broadway this season. I was like, oh, how
The
do I
3-week
wallpaper on
the 3-week statistic was
Yeah, it's in the 16 years. And that for a while, that was something I thought was a reasonable aspiration. I thought maybe I would get a chance to do this. And
Are there women who are directing or
Yes.
choreographing who are known as director choreographers outside of Broadway?
That's an excellent question, and I haven't really looked at that. And not every, I think Julie Taymor is a great example when she was talking about choreographing things, but she's certainly not known as a choreographer in the way that a lot of these other women are. So I think, and for some of these people, it depends on the project. Susan Stroman didn't choreograph Smash, but that made a lot of sense because the numbers from the TV show had already been very recognizably choreographed by someone else. So, it's an interesting question, but that's an interesting idea for pursuing further. Thank you.
Questions?
Actually, I have one first. Of both the men and the women, how many were non-white?
None.
So
Well,
that's
I
even
mean,
more shocking.
yes, it is. I mean, I shouldn't say that. Graziella Danielle, Sergio Trillo, who's a very new, a new addition to that. I think we have there are upcoming Black women director choreographers, but they haven't had those Broadway breaks, and who knows when they will get them, since nobody else has had one either for 16 years, which seems just stunning to me.
Thank you. This is really great research, and as a professional director, I'm quite aware of everything you're talking about. But when you're talking about a director choreographer, most of the ones that do both come from the dance world within theater, and there's a whole different power dynamic, as I perceived, from how someone rises from the ranks, like Susan Stroman did, like Warren Carlyle did. They were both chorus people before they became director choreographers. How much of your research yet have you looked at how that rising from the chorus and knowing that? Because most directors, most trained directors, are not going to be able to choreograph. So you need to have the dance sensibility to be able to do that. So how much of it is just a power dynamic that comes from how you rise out of the chorus?
I've actually done quite a bit of work on this because I've been really interested in the question of how do you break in? There is no manual that says, here's what to do if you want to be a director or a director choreographer on Broadway. Of those original 6 women I profiled, they all were chorus dancers, rose to dance captain, and then assistant to prominent director choreographers. That was a really logical trajectory through, especially because many of those early male director choreographers like Michael Bennett, or they used female assistants so they could demonstrate partnering. So it sort of made sense that there was another generation of women ready to step in, and that absolutely is the trajectory really for all of these women. I think a few of the women that I hadn't included previously are the ones that didn't have that trajectory, that have a director choreographer credit, but not in the same sense as coming out of that dance world with a show that is dance focused. But it's interesting, I thought things would flip around with these women having male assistants, but so few women have come up in the ranks that I initially was hypothesizing that might be why men were, but most of those men were not the assistants. In fact, the women director choreographers make a priority of hiring women to assist them. So there's not, a clear path, but you're absolutely right. That is absolutely the trajectory.
I have 2 observations and a question.
Sure.
Joe Layton, what's the deal? I agree. In No Strings and also Scaretto in Tokyo, he directed these really big shows doing innovative things with technology ahead of their time.
I do feel like I wanted to shout him out because I feel like it's a really untapped place there is nothing on him. Literally, you can find things in reviews.
We can fix it.
Yeah, I know. Somebody in this room, I don't know if I can fix all of this and that, but somebody needs to cover him because that is a huge oversight in the literature that he's not covered.
Other observation, Donna Fiore, director choreographer from Canada, who's been directing regionally in the US, but not breaking through, but still dazzling at Stratford with her production. So that's kind of interesting.
Okay,
and
yeah.
Melissa King is an African-American Japanese director choreographer based in Europe who has decades of experience. So I think it's interesting they're not in the US. My question is, do you think the what do we call it? What do you call the supply chain?
The pipeline?
The pipeline. Sorry, blanking on words. Do you think the pipeline issue has anything to do with the shift from people entering the industry as performers from their local dance studios, the stories we hear in A Chorus Line, versus the conservatory programs, the triple threat BFA programs at colleges, where you're not being indoctrinated by that one teacher who's, iconic and maybe inspiring you to leadership in a way your college professors in the BFA are not going to do?
That's a great. I had not. I've looked at different ways of training director choreographers, and there remains not one. The apprenticeship model is really ingrained into the structure of Broadway. So when the apprenticeship model falls apart, what's left? And I think every director, for the most part, that's on Broadway, even the 2 men that just made their debuts this year, they've choreographed so many things. I mean, enormous numbers before they're entrusted with directing. So it's not an easy breakthrough for anyone. But that's a great question and something to consider as I consider working on this.
Yeah, just to follow up, well, the people I was thinking about they're not director choreographers, but Jessica Stone, who directed Kimberly Akimbo, and Whitney White, who directed Last 5 Years, who is also a choreographer, but she did not choreograph Last 5 Years. But I was thinking, similar to Laura's question, about MFA programs and how the MFA forces a kind of pre-professionalism and narrowing, and that that kind of training does not seem to align with the kind of multidisciplinary, multivalent skills that a director choreographer needs. So I wonder if the degree to which MFA programs give someone an connections, a community, is also ultimately disincentivizing women. And there was an interview with Janine Tesori in something published, and she was asked, why aren't there more women on Broadway? And she said, childcare.
Yeah. Preach. That's my sister's watching my 8-year-old, right now, so I can do this.
Well, I was thinking of Rachel Rockwell, who had done a lot of directing and choreographing in Chicago, and then went off Broadway with Ride the Cyclone and then died. And who they showed on the Tonys when she died, which we were shocked by. We went to school with her, my partner and I. So anyway.
I think all of these, there are so many talented women directing and choreographing around the country and around the world. And this barrier has become, it's not that the talent isn't there. That is not the problem. It's the way to connect the talent with the opportunities. And clearly, male director choreographers have found the way to navigate that, at least comparably to what women have been able to navigate.
Camille Brown, who was supposed to be here originally,
She would be the
he brought
one.
her in as a choreographer, but she made it very clear that she wanted to be credited both as a choreographer and a director, even though she hasn't directed yet on Broadway. She has directed and choreographed on Broadway.
She's the one I'm thinking of that will be the first Black woman to direct and choreograph on Broadway. But again, it's been 16 years, so who knows how long. She should have already had that opportunity in her work in, like, For Colored Girls, which isn't quite a musical, but kind of is. You know, like it's on that choreo poem, kind of skates the line. But I truly, she's one I'm banking on. I sure hope I'm right. I was wrong earlier, but I hope that she is the next one to bring. And I'm sorry, I understand why she wasn't here, but I had really hoped to hear from her because I think she's an immense talent.
Do we have time for one more?
Very fast.
Sure.
I was thinking about all the ballet companies that have women directors, both here, like Suzanne Farrell, the Tall Chiefs in England, Marie Rambert, and Annette de Valois. And I wonder if you just ever, like a footnote or something, connect the number of women directing dance companies and either choreographing for those or hiring, you know, male and female choreographers. And Twyla Tharp is an obvious one as well, who has sort of straddled both. But I just wondered if you'd consider.
I did when I did the original research, but I haven't for this latest body of research. But I do think there's less, a lot of these women that I originally interviewed did come out of professional dance companies and had that experience. And most of the more recent ones did not. I think this again gets to, so where are they coming from? Is it the MFA? It seems like the pipeline's broken for women, and we haven't really replaced it with something else. So, and we need to. And hopefully, you know, those of you in this room can shout loudly about the amazing contributions that all of these women have done and continue to do. And hopefully we will have a conference about how triumphantly we have progressed in a few years.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
And now I think we're throwing it back to Dominic and Stacy.
I have one. Thank you. Let's give Dominic that one. Okay.
Would you like too much?
He'd like all the mics.
Am I working? Yes, hooray.
Okay, here we are.
Well, Stacy, I did
Hi.
want to begin by saying thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
To you for being here and for your participation and engagement, and to acknowledge how so much of the work we've heard about could never have happened without your foundational work, which is so obvious from the number of times that you've been name-checked. I was thinking half an hour ago, for some reason, about back to last summer when I gathered in all of the submissions for the conference, and you guys, the rest of the committee, had no idea. Everything was anonymized. So I basically anonymized all of the submissions and then had no part in grading or voting on which ones were going to get through or anything like that, and was smiling to myself as I was doing this because I could see that most of the strong work was coming from women and queer scholars and artists and industry figures. And then I had to wait several months to see whether you guys were going to agree, and then you had no idea that that was the case while you were voting because there were no names attached. You had no idea who did it. And then we've ended up with a room dominated by women and non-binary people for the last 3 days, which I think is one of the things that's been powerful about this. How do you think that that has affected the work?
Well, I think what we're demonstrating today, or among the things we demonstrate today, I mean, I really appreciate that we ended with a paper that's ultimately about advocacy and information, and how important information is to our advocacy. And I think, as we'll say again in this room, how important the work of Dr. Carla Hayden has been to the vision of the Library of Congress, how important your work is, Mark. All of you guys, thank you so much. And we need information for advocacy, we need books, we need research, we need free speech, we need the arts, and none of us would be here. And I think, unlike the professional theater or the Broadway theater world, I would love it, Mary Jo, to have all of the things that you found out for also the regional theater and all the other different kinds of theater. But I think one thing that we have seen is that women and non-binary people have excelled in the academy, and not at my university, I would say, in terms of full professors, the statistics are not super awesome, but at least in our field of musical studies, we're looking much more equal in terms of gender, not so much in terms of race, which I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of encouraging our junior colleagues of color, our students of color, to see themselves in this work that we do, in this research that we do. So I think in some ways we've come really far. It's amazing to be in a room with all of you and hear the work, and I also think we have a lot of work to do in our own community.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope you don't mind me mentioning this, but one of the great joys of the week for me has been meeting your mother.
Well, that's what I was going to say about my mom. Yes, shout out to my mother.
Absolutely.
Who's been here for the whole entire thing. Yes, she has sat through many wonderful papers.
And I was just struck by how much she seemed to be getting out of it. And also, there are many people been joining online. We've had around 100 people, a great deal of the last 2 days tuning in, many of them not of the Academy at all. So I was wondering, do you have any thoughts on the idea that all of this scholarship actually is of interest to the wider world, and kind of why and how that works? I don't know what my question is, but do you see what I mean? It's very
yes,
striking.
no,
as a
I
dynamic.
completely see what you mean, because as I've said to you, and I said to Mark, it's absolutely amazing to me that my mother and I came to this conference together, and my mother is very smart and knows a lot about theater, but is not a theater scholar, is not an academic, has read all my books, because she's my mom. But I think that we could both be here through these days and learn so much and get so much out of it, and at the end of the day say, well, what did you find interesting and what did you find interesting? And we found similar things interesting. And I think most of us who teach musicals in some way, our students come to our classes because they are in love with musical theater and musical film and television. And our jobs, I think, are to teach them to do the kind of analysis and interpretation that we've seen over the past few days, whether it's archival research or bringing to the fore artists and makers who we haven't heard about, or looking at a show that we think we know and then looking at it completely differently, or analyzing the music super closely. And I feel like we are at such an advantage in terms of what we teach and what we work on, because the people who come to us love it, and we love it. In fact, after the first day, my mom said, everyone is so enthusiastic. And everyone really seems to love what they do. And I think there's great pleasure, and so many people yesterday and today have talked about the pleasure and the analysis. And I also so appreciate how everyone in this room tries to find that place that embraces pleasure and embraces critique, and that we can love it and we can criticize it, and our love for the form is what helps us to be critical of the form. And I think that's accessible to people, and I think probably all of us in this room can attest to how awesome it is when your students tell you that they really hate Phantom of the Opera, but now they understand much more why they loved it before, when they were a small child, or whatever it is that they're going to say. So it has to do with, affection and research and scholarship.
And kind of explaining our humanity to ourselves sometimes.
Totally,
It's kind of some good scholarship can do that,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, what do you think?
About
Why do people want to listen, and why could my mother and I enjoy all this?
I think that people's relationship in the wider world with the musical is incredibly personal. I mean, I think back to being 6 and seeing The Sound of Music on the TV for the first time, and then many years later coming and seeing Rodgers and Hammerstein's manuscripts. It has a romance about it, and also then some of the stories or the readings or analyses that we then get from the Academy really make us think differently about something that we love. I think it's that straightforward. And also, so many of you are performers or have a kind of performance background that makes, or are just very good academics, and therefore are very good at explaining things or articulating things in a non-pretentious and very digestible way.
That's true.
Which is particular to popular culture studies, whatever the discipline.
Right.
And that, I think, helps people to access it in ways that might not be the case with medicine.
Right.
My dad was a biochemist, so I can speak.
You can speak from experience. So what would you say is the state of our field based on the past couple of days?
I think it's interesting.
Our fields. I should say our fields.
Fields, a whole meadow of different fields. Okay.
Like in Wicked, with all the different color flowers.
I think it's so inspiring to see people growing. I'm getting old now. I'm becoming middle-aged, and encountering people's work. I know.
Thank you.
Oh, we are at the end, so I thought I'd be humorous. But watching people grow and watching people's thought and research grow, I think is very inspiring. And seeing who digs in and whose understanding is growing and how they're responding and being self-critical, and the outcomes of that seem very powerful to me. I think with this particular topic, there are 2 things struck me as being challenging in advance. One is avoiding essentializing femininity or womanhood, which is a big danger when you start getting into any identity-related thing, that you start defaulting to stereotypes that then really don't help and make the whole thing difficult. And the other is avoiding making women heroes to in the male model, if that makes sense. If the problem with canon is the sort of connotation of heroism, then having more canon, and more heroism, that's the thing that has excluded women and people of color and disabled people historically, then it's a problem to just reinforce it and go, and here's a convenient figure that we could add to it, without thinking, how do we disrupt the whole way we think about history, for example, or our subject. So I think that we're at an inspiring place of needing to go further and work out what the next step with all of this information is, because it's just overwhelming, it's distressing to encounter all these shows and figures that we ought to know about, but at the same time we need to do more than just add them like Wikipedia entries to our knowledge. There needs to be this sort of more, how do we rethink in a bigger sense?
Right. I love that point. And I think that all of the papers that in some ways recuperated figures about whom we knew little, or some of us, I'll speak for myself, knew little or nothing, or to whom we were introduced, all demonstrated a feminist historiography. I don't think anyone did a straightforward, okay, and now this person is great and we need to know more about them, but the way in which these women made their marks was always through a feminist historiographical lens, which I really, really appreciated. There were a couple other things I want to say. Can I say a few more things?
Please.
Because I wrote.
I know. I love your notepad.
I know.
It's full.
I know. This is, yes, okay.
This
anyway.
notepad number 3.
Okay, well, one thing I did want to do is express my appreciation to Jeffrey Block, because my work never would have happened without his work. And he was among the very first scholars to take musical theater seriously as an art and entertainment form in conversation with American culture. And I learned so much from him. I can't see where he's sitting because the lights are in my eyes. Okay, hi, yes. I go back to his books all the time, constantly. Such a model, and really, to your point, Dom, such a model of clarity, accessibility, persuasiveness, analysis, archival research. And I think growing from your work, another thing that I so appreciated about this conference is that all of us start in different fields, whether it's media and film studies, television studies, music, musicology, ethnomusicology, theater studies, dance studies, and we can comfortably speak to each other. And it was not all that long ago when it was very hard for us to understand each other's language. And I think even if the subject was a musical, those of us who grew up in theater studies had a really hard time understanding what the musicologists were saying, and vice versa. And I feel like now we've all so much learned each other's methods, each other's approaches, and I also feel like there's incredible generosity in our field of musical studies to welcome each other in by speaking clearly, by demystifying jargon, and by really bringing honor to this form of art and entertainment that we all love so much and want to untangle. So I appreciate that we're all in this room together.
I love that, and I'd love to have more film studies people engaged.
Yes.
Because I think
Yes.
when we say the musical, I'm not accusing you, but too many of us default to Broadway or the musical theater.
And the film papers that we had were so awesome.
Were so good, and I feel like film studies at its best is so liberated and imaginative when it comes to readings of things. Because I think about my classical music background, which I love and proud of, and I'm glad to have had it, and I love classical music, but I think it does push us along certain trains of thoughts, whereas I read film studies stuff, I go, wow, I just love the fact you can just wreak poetry across the page, and that's your scholarship at its best. So that's something I'd love to see more of. I wish we could have, more participation. It's been so great to have Adrian. Yeah, you've been great.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, it's a
Yes.
big deal to have you here,
Yeah,
actually,
it's great.
for this reason, because I got so much out of that Eleanor Powell presentation, precisely because of all those other things coming through that are part of the same world of ideas and the same culture and the same historical moments. We've got 3 minutes left. You said you had about 3 things to say, so... Okay,
I wanted to say something
Okay.
about the treasures. Can I talk about the
Yes,
show
I
and
was gonna
tell?
ask
Are we
you,
going to
but-
talk about
yeah,
that?
Yeah,
Okay.
So on Wednesday, we saw this amazing display of treasures which Janet and Kate have spent literally months putting together. And I should say, I was trying to encourage Kate earlier to apply for a Kluger Fellowship so that she could publish a source book. Because I think rather than just publishing one person's papers around that, to bring together loads of these documents from the archives and demonstrate all of those different ideas, people, works would be amazing. So what stood out for you?
Well, the first thing that stood out for me was the difficulty I imagined Janet and Kate had in assembling this material, because when we ultimately write an article or a book chapter and we have hundreds of thousands of pages that are on the floor, just thinking about how carefully and beautifully curated that assemblage of material was. And also I said this to you too the other night, how wonderfully the teachers who stood behind each of those tables welcomed us in, and those of us who might not have known how to interpret the materials were on the table, they really helped us to see what story it was being told. I think my absolute favorite things were, of course, the letters from Sister Gregory about the sound of music. I loved those so much. And I also really loved Janine Tesori's copy of Fun Home with the Post-its stuck in. I mean, I loved, was it Peggy Clark who drew? Yeah.
Yep.
So Peggy Clark's letters to her family with the beautiful sketches of rehearsal. But I loved every single thing. Mom, what were you going to say that you loved? Were you going to say something? Oh, okay. Yeah, we spent so much time in there, and they were just absolutely incredible. And it was the perfect way to begin our time together and reappreciation of the archives and how incredible they are.
And why we need the Library of
and
Congress.
why we need the Library of Congress.
Absolutely. Any final thoughts for the conference people before they go on their way, before we thank?
I just want to thank everyone so much for coming with your incredible, amazing work. It makes me so excited about our field, so looking forward to seeing all of everybody's work between covers or on the internet or in a podcast or whatever form they take.